we have been discussing about this paper which has been introduced in semester 1 UGCF entitled as Introduction to Philosophy, which is a DSC paper, discipline specific core paper for the students of first semester in University of Delhi from the Department of Philosophy. We continue teaching this paper today further with the theme of classification of philosophy. This is Dr. Ananya Barua, Associate Professor in the Department of Philosophy, Hindu College. Now, when we try to classify philosophy, we will understand that there will be philosophers from the West, there will be philosophers from the East, and at the very onset, it is significant that we talk about some of the comparative introduction section here, which is to do with Russell, Puligandla and Kautilya. Now, the first question is, why read these three together? Russell, Puligandla and Kautilya, though they come from very different traditions, these texts together show that philosophy is not merely abstract speculation. It is a systematic inquiry into reality, knowledge, value and practice. Classification reflects cultural priorities. Russell, for example, is someone who has specifically and methodologically talked about analytical and historical. Indian tradition has talked about the metaphysical or the soteriological side. Kautilya, of course, has been the practical, political, ethical terrain. So together, they present a narrow definition of philosophy. Bertrand Russell. Now, in his work, History of Western Philosophy, basically the introduction, which is from pages 1 to 10, we pick up Russell because of the classification from the Western tradition. Now, Russell's conception of philosophy, Russell places philosophy between science, which is certain empirical knowledge, theology, which is dogmatic belief, and then comes philosophy in between that deals with questions that cannot yet be answered scientifically but must be asked rationally. Now, Russell's implicit classification does not give a rigid list, but his work presupposes these core branches, which is metaphysics, nature of reality, substance, mind, matter, epistemology, knowledge, truth, belief, certainty, logic, the structure of valid reasoning, ethics, of course, which is about good, evil, moral obligation, science and political philosophy, which talks about justice, power, authority. So Russell emphasizes on reason, clarity and argument. He is suspicious of metaphysical excess. Philosophy progresses historically through critique. So there of course has also been a limitation of Bertrand Russell, and as such the critical note is that Russell marginalizes the non-Western philosophies, treats philosophy mainly as theoretical inquiry and to a large extent downplays spiritual or practical dimensions. Then we have Ramakrishna Puligandla in his Indian philosophical or with his Indian philosophical classification, and Puligandla has largely picked up, or his work is from this volume Fundamentals of Indian Philosophy, General Introduction, and the pages which are being prescribed in the syllabus is between pages 1 to pages 12. Now, Puligandla explicitly systemizes Indian philosophy, correcting Western misunderstandings. The core classification in Indian philosophy with Puligandla, we see Indian philosophy is traditionally organized around four interrelated concerns. Metaphysics, which is to do with Tattva, Padarth, that is to talk about Brahman, Atman, Prakriti, Purusha. Epistemology, the Pramana, which is the means of valid knowledge such as perception, inference, testimony. Ethics, Dharma, which is to do with moral order, duty, right conduct. soteriology, which is basically moksha, and that is liberation as the final aim. So in Indian philosophy, knowledge is never purely theoretical. It is oriented towards liberation or moksha. This is the decisive difference from Russell. So, Puligandla's contribution, we see, he rejects the idea that Indian philosophy is mystical. He shows a rigorous logic, nyaya, ontology, sankhya, and epistemology, Buddhist schools. He emphasizes pluralism of schools or darshanas. However, there are limitations here as well, and we see his is a strong metaphysical orientation and less emphasis on political philosophy except in texts like Kautilya. Then we have Kautilya's Arthashastra, a practical classification of philosophy, specifically Book 1, Section 1 to 3 as has been prescribed. And Kautilya offers one of the earliest systematic classifications of knowledge in Indian thought. Kautilya's four-fold classification of knowledge or vidya, which is anvikshiki or philosophy as a critical inquiry, where of course Sankhya, Yoga, Lokayata or the materialism have already covered. The Trai or the Vedas, where we have dharma and ritual knowledge, Varta or economics, agriculture, trade, cattle rearing, Dandaniti, where we talk about political science, governance, law, administration. Now, what is this importance of anvikshiki? Kautilya calls philosophy the lamp of all sciences, the means of all actions. This is crucial. Philosophy, which trains critical reasoning, prevents blind reliance on scripture, guides ethical governance. Now, what is the radical feature? It includes Lokayata or materialism as philosophy. Philosophy is instrumental and practical. Knowledge is evaluated by its social utility. Now, in this PPT, which is being displayed here, if we look at the comparative table amongst the three philosophers, we see the orientation of Russell has been theoretical, Puligandla has been metaphysical or soteriological, and Kautilya is largely practical or political. The core concern of Russell has been with truth and reason. Puligandla has been liberation or moksha, Kautilya, statecraft and welfare. Role of philosophy for Russell is critical inquiry. Puligandla is path to liberation. Kautilya is guide to governance. Further, the view of ethics for Russell, it is rational morality. Puligandla, it is dharma based. Kautilya, it is political realism. For the inclusion of materialism, for Russell, we see it is minimal. Puligandla, there has been a critical engagement, and Kautilya, I think it is explicit, for example, in the Lokayata or Indian materialism called Charvaka. So, the point then is philosophy stands as an integrated high-level approach where these three texts show that philosophy can be speculative as in the format of Russell, liberative as with Puligandla, and definitely instrumental as in Kautilya. So, no single classification is exhaustive. Philosophy is best understood as family of inquiries shaped by cultural needs and historical contexts. Now, Russell classifies philosophy as a rational inquiry situated between science and theology, emphasizing logic, metaphysics and epistemology. Puligandla, on the other hand, shows that Indian philosophy integrates metaphysics, epistemology, ethics and soteriology with liberation as its goal, and Kautilya offers a pragmatic classification where philosophy or anvikshiki functions as critical reasoning supporting economics and politics. Together, they demonstrate that philosophy is not merely speculative but also ethical and practical. Now, Western philosophy prioritizes explanation. In brief, Indian philosophy prioritizes liberation, and Kautilya reminds us that philosophy ultimately serves life and governance. Now we will try to connect it to these various modules further. Our first question then is, why is epistemology the unifying thread? At first glance, these texts seem to classify philosophy, but beneath that, they are really classifying what counts as knowledge, how it is acquired, and what is it for. That is what epistemology is so all about. Now with Russell, epistemology has been treated as the foundation of philosophy, where Russell's epistemological assumption stems from Russell treating philosophy as a rational inquiry grounded in logic and analysis, concerned with justification and certainty. His epistemology relies or rests on logical analysis, empirical grounding, and critical doubt. Philosophy exists because science does not yet have settled answers. Theology claims certainty without justification. Thus, philosophy is an epistemic intermediary. Now, if we look at the PPT here about the epistemological orientation of Bertrand Russell, we see that the source of knowledge for Russell is all sense data and logic. The attitude towards certainty is fallibilism. The role of philosophy is to clarify concepts, and the goal of knowledge is about truth. So Russell's classifications assumes that epistemology precedes metaphysics. Now, with the second stop of Puligandla, who is an epistemologist, we see that the Pramanavad as a structured and plural epistemology is placed. Indian epistemology, according to Puligandla, emphasizes that Indian philosophy begins with Pramana theory. It classifies knowledge sources, especially common features like Pratyaksha, which is to do with perception, Anumana, which is to do with inference, Shabda, testimony, Upamana, then Arthapati, Anupalabdhi, which are school dependent, of course. And then we have knowledge, which is valid insofar as it leads towards liberation or moksha. Thus, epistemology is teleological, unlike in Russell, and knowledge is not neutral, it is normatively guided. Similarly, if we look at the PPT here, we see that the features such as the source for Puligandla has been multiple pramanas. The truth for Puligandla has been pragmatic, liberative. Error for Puligandla is avidya. Goal is moksha. Truth is what works in sustaining social order. Now further, if we classify the various aspects, we see that about epistemic authority, Russell is all about reason and logic, Puligandla is all about pramanas, Kautilya is about rational evaluation. Now, role of experience for Russell, it is all empirical, Puligandla it is experiential and spiritual, Kautilya is practical. And again, about the attitude to scripture, we see Russell, it is skeptical, Puligandla, it is qualified acceptance, and Kautilya is subordinate. About the goal of knowing, Russell is all about truth, Puligandla is liberation, Kautilya is welfare. Similarly, about error, Russell is all about logical confusion, Puligandla is avidya, Kautilya, poor judgment. So, we see that these three, be it Russell, be it Puligandla, be it Kautilya, represents three epistemic orientations. Epistemology of justification, Russell, epistemology of liberation, Puligandla, and epistemology of action, Kautilya. And they answer different versions of the epistemological question, what can we know, Russell? How should we know to be free, Puligandla? What must we know to govern well, Kautilya? Now, with this, we should further ask then, how does this help to teach epistemology? So, we understand that epistemology is framed not as a dry theory of knowledge, but as a culturally embedded inquiry into valid knowing and its purpose. This decolonizes epistemology without rejecting rigor. So, be it Russell, be it Puligandla and Kautilya, they classify philosophy in ways that reflect distinct epistemological priorities. Russell emphasizes justification and clarity. Puligandla foregrounds pramana theory and the liberative function of knowledge, and Kautilya treats knowledge instrumentally, valuing rational inquiry for effective action and governance. Together, they show that epistemology is not only about sources of knowledge but also about the ends knowledge serves. Now, at this juncture, we are good to understand about how epistemology is across cultures, knowing, justification, and the ends of knowledge. Now, why should we even be interested about epistemology across cultures? Traditional epistemology often assumes a universal knower, a single epistemic standard which is to do with justification, truth. Cross-cultural epistemology shows instead that ways of showing are shaped by historical needs, social structures, and existential aims. This does not imply relativism, only pluralism with standards. The core of epistemological questions, the universals, across cultures. Epistemology asks, what is knowledge? What are the valid sources of knowledge? How is error possible? What is knowledge for? Different cultures give different weight to these questions. Western epistemology, the classical to modern, the core orientation, the justification and truth. The key features have been that it emphasizes on belief, truth and justification. It is all about individual knower and it uses analytical methods. Sources of knowledge is to do with perception, reason, inference, testimony, which is secondary. Now, in the canonical trajectory, if we are to see this theme of epistemology, we see that with Plato, there had been in a way the JTB or the justified true belief, though he was not someone who had actually concluded, but it is implicit. With Descartes, we see the trend of foundationalism. With Hume, we see skepticism. Kant, conditions of possibility. Russell, logical analysis. So the goal of knowledge, the truth and certainty or justified belief had been there. Now, in the Indian context, Indian epistemology, we have the pramana theory. In this, it's all about validity and liberation. Indian philosophy asks, which cognitions leads us out of ignorance? Pramana is the means of valid knowledge. The common pramanas are the pratyaksha, anumana, shabda, upamana, arthapati and the anupalabdhi. Epistemology is systematically classified and error or avidya is existential. So we see that the goal of knowledge in the Indian epistemology is nirvana or moksha based, or it is liberation based. So knowledge is inseparable from ethical and soteriological goals. Now that we have talked about Indian epistemology, let us also talk about Chinese epistemology. Now the Confucian or the Taoist or the Taoism that we talk about, here it is all about practical wisdom and harmony. The Confucian epistemology talks about knowledge arises through moral cultivation, social roles, ritual practice. Here, truth is lived, not abstract. In Taoism or Taoist epistemology, it is skeptical of rigid knowledge. It emphasizes non-conceptual knowing. It is to do with attunement to Tao, spontaneity or Ziran, and the goal of knowledge is harmony with self, society and nature. With Buddhist epistemology, especially Dignaga and Dharmakirti, we see that the core orientation is freedom from suffering. The key concepts are perception or pratyaksha as non-conceptual. Inference here is anumana, momentariness, and no enduring self or the anatmavad theory. So knowledge is valid if it eliminates ignorance, reduces suffering, and truth is pragmatic and therapeutic as in the Buddhist epistemology, or as of that matter, Confucius epistemology, which was all about practicality. Now let us also try to understand something about Islamic epistemology. The core point here is all about reason and revelation. The sources of knowledge for Islamic epistemology is reason or akal, experience, and revelation or waha. So some of the thinkers of Islamic epistemologists are, but not restricted to, Al-Farabi, Ibn Sina, Al-Ghazali, Ibn Rushd, and we see, however, there is a key tension in Islamist epistemology, which is philosophy versus theology, rational certainty versus spiritual insight. And the goal of knowledge here is understanding divine order and ethical life. We also have this domain called the indigenous epistemologies. Now, in the indigenous epistemologies, there is a relational knowledge features where knowledge is communal, oral, situated, land-based. Truth is validated by ancestral continuity, ecological balance, social coherence. Here, the knower is never isolated. We will be talking more about the various traditions, the Buddhist, the Islamic, the indigenous, and of course the Western Indian Chinese in our next class. And we will see what their concerns, the sources and the goal have been in our comparative epistemological lecture that we have been adhering to now. Thank you so much.